Good Christian name, huh? Don't tell my parents. I come from an Eastern European Jewish background. My grandfather was born on the Russian-Polish border in what's called the Jewish Pale of Settlement. They used to stick all the Jews in ghettos, which gave them the not-so-rare opportunity, especially on Easter, for the Russian peasants to go and burn Jewish villages because all the Jews were gathered in one place. Well, that's the gory story for the afternoon. But the original family name was Batinsky. I want to see what you do metaphysically with that. A lot of the committee members are here, but for those of you not on the committee and those of you who may buy this out in tape recorder land, which is a close relative of out there in radio land and out there on the cable, these annual workshops that we hold every year give New Thoughters a chance to learn about the disability subcultures without being in the embarrassing position of going up to somebody on the street and asking questions or doing something else which they think would be frightening. So we provide a safe place. There are 4 groups of people we can talk about in terms of disability subcultures. There are the people with disability themselves. There are the families of the disabled people. There are the professionals who take care of providing services for disabled people. And there is you, John Q. Public, out there, and Jane Q. Public, who increasingly, since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, will be getting to know more and more of us. There are, as I said Wednesday, 43 million, and it's difficult to hide 43 million of anything anywhere. Dr. Susan told me that mental illness is the largest group of disabled people and yet one of the least understood, particularly among New Thought people, where we say that everything has to do with the power of the mind. Mental illness could be considered a threatening topic. All the more reason for us to do it under the auspices of the committee. And so I'm going to relinquish much of my time, as I have learned how to talk like a political animal over these last few business meetings, so that we can all learn from the professional component of disability culture, which is our genuine minister and psychiatrist. But with that, I will give the floor back to our presider. I love this. It sounds like an earthquake. I'm giving back the floor. We're practicing for San Diego. We'll introduce our special guest of the afternoon.
Thank you, and I'll take it back very temporarily. Our next speaker is the Associate Minister of Hillside Community Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She received her M.D. from Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, and completed a 4-year residency in psychiatry at the University of New Mexico, affiliated hospitals, serving as chief resident at the Albuquerque County Medical Center or Hospital. There's another name there, but I'm quite sure that one will do. It says where she was at. She also holds a BA in political science and education from the University of Houston. Now, ordained as a minister through the Brooks Divinity School, she has been an active leader at Hillside since its beginning, Previously, she was a staff psychiatrist at the Albuquerque Veterans Medical Center, and for 5 years was in the private practice of psychiatry. She has extensive experience in teaching psychological and spiritual tools for self-discovery and self-healing, and supervises Hillside's pastoral counseling program. Please welcome Dr. Susan Nettleton.
Let's see. Before we get started, I'm going to take a moment to, for my own sake here, to just do a little prayer. Let's turn within for just a moment, just to relax. And in order to allow ourselves to let go of the day, whatever your day's been about. And we can table that. And we can also just decide to set aside the afternoon ahead, whatever our schedule holds for us, or concerns we might have about the evening ahead and such, going home, all those things. So that we might be here now and be open and receptive to new ideas and new understanding, and we'll let the wisdom and the intelligence of God reveal that to us as we move through the time together. We'll let it be so. So it is. Amen. I have to do that, or else I won't be clear about my role here. Well, I'm real happy for the opportunity to speak about New Thought and mental illness. It's a tough subject. But at the same time, it's a subject that really has interested me for a long time because you're mentioning the background. And, during all that, my years in psychiatry and such, my years on the wards and at the county mental hospital, I was very involved in New Thought. In fact, my experience in the spiritual life and New Thought really came before my journey into medicine. A lot of times people assume that I went through medicine and then got involved in New Thought, and it was actually the other way around. So I have a much longer history in the New Thought teachings and in my own spiritual life. So I walked this journey through psychiatry, through the other medical experiences as well. But through the psychiatric experience and through some very tough situations with mental illness, with the questions underlying it, how do these things integrate? You see, what does the New Thought teaching and my own spiritual belief, what good is it going to do in the lives of the people that I am working with? And I tried a lot of different things. And programmatically, when I had some authority, programmatically, I tried them one-on-one in very small confines of a little office I had at the VA. And I tried them in prayer work, in terms of my own prayer work for the people that I worked with and the tough problems that I had to deal with. And I didn't find much help, when it came to really trying to put together these the experience, the direct experience with people, and the teachings. And I remember at one time, the biggest thing that the mentally ill have to suffer with, out of all the problems, the biggest thing is stigma. Still, stigma. Even though it's a very tough thing to go through an illness, it's another thing to go through an illness which is highly stigmatized in our society. It's number one problem. And there's a support group. It's not at our church. It's at a Catholic church in town that exists for mentally ill and their families. And there was one of the people who attended that support group who showed up, told his story about having visited 5 other churches previously to make some spiritual connections. And out of 4 of those 5 churches, when he came, he was told that he was possessed by the devil because he had schizophrenia. And, we're shocked by that, maybe. We think how absurd that somebody would be told they're possessed by the devil because they're schizophrenic. 4 out of 5 churches. And yet, what do we think causes schizophrenia? You have to think about that. What do we think is wrong with that person, that they have schizophrenia? And whether or not the stigma doesn't exist, of course, in our own teachings in our own belief system, in our own churches, of course. It just reformulated maybe in another way. But the biggest barrier that they encounter has to do with this stigma. So I feel that it's important to talk a little bit about that. I know what else I want to tell you about this. Trying to integrate. I went to a retreat once. Wasn't INTA, but it was a retreat. And on the program, very large attendance, and on the program there was a very prominent New Thought minister, I won't mention names, very prominent in the New Thought movement, who was on the platform along with one of the very prominent physicians in this country who deals with the holistic alternative health movement. Okay, so we got outspoken people for both New Thought as well as legitimized by a physician who deals with alternative healing. And they went through their long, very inspiring talk on healing and on the principles and integrating different techniques. And this was when I was a resident. I was on the wards at a very busy county mental health center. And as I said before, tough problem. We're dealing with psychotic people all the time, and the ravages of their lives on a social level, not just, again, illness, but the social implications of the disease. And here I am, I'm carrying this weight, right? I'm carrying this weight of trying to figure out, believing that God had called me into medicine and into psychiatry. This was before ministry, but into psychiatry. And here I've got this background in metaphysics and years of metaphysics, and I got this other background. And I'm dealing with these problems, and I think, well, what about the mentally ill? Nobody said anything. What about it? So I finally got my courage up. I was way in the back of the room. Big turnout, bigger than our meeting here, maybe about the biggest meetings. And I asked, I said, well, what about schizophrenia? In terms of what you've been talking about. Well, there was like this hush. I said the S word. I shouldn't have said it. And there's just like this silence, and then the minister at least had the guts to say, I've never really thought about it. Never really thought about it. Well, at least he had the courage to say it, and he deferred to the physician. And the physician said, well, I tell you, in our center, he had a healing center, we've had good luck at least in a third of the people with past life regressions. Well, this, I tell you, did not satisfy me. Right, wrong, or different, whatever you feel about past life regressions. If you do nothing to a schizophrenic, a third of schizophrenics will recover. The third that don't recover were the third most of the time I was dealing with on the wards, although we would have new admissions of people who would get better and would probably never come back to a psychiatric hospital. So this didn't satisfy. And I tried not to let it eat at me. I tried not to be judging. But over the years, I think my frustration grew that much more with that kind of, I don't know what the word is, maybe just indifference. So, how do we bring the mentally ill into the body of our understanding? How do we bring the facts, first of all, into our body of understanding? And of course, my understanding of the disability outreach is how do we bring them into the whole teachings? My perspective is from a church growth perspective, because for me, bringing people in teaching means bringing them into church. So that's probably a bias I have. So my concern is how do we integrate the fact of mental illness into the metaphysical churches? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the mentally ill before we go any further. Now, I have to say this. About statistics, I think statistics are useful things because they tell us about large bodies of people. You have to understand that's what statistics are. Statistics are describing large groups of people, and they're describing large trends within those groups. Statistics don't, of course, speak to the experience of the individual, right? And one of the things I do want to mention here before we begin to talk a little bit is the things that we as New Thought can offer the mentally ill and their families in the way of the uniqueness of our teachings, that is very helpful. So I want to stress that we have unique things to offer, right? And one of those unique things that we do offer is the fact that we don't limit the individual to statistics. So we affirm that the individual is the individual regardless of the statistical prognosis or regardless of how they fit into the big picture. So I want to say that, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we have to throw out statistics because they're helpful to us to understand. Now, Ross said that I told her that the mentally ill is the largest body of the disabled in this country. National Institute of Mental Health estimates that at any given 6 months in our country, there are 36 million people suffering from mental illness. Now, I don't know about the 42 million statistic we've been quoting about the disabled and how that's defined, whether or not that's in terms, again, whether they include the mentally ill in that. Probably they do. Probably they include the 10 million that suffer from chronic mental illness. Okay, so there's a difference between someone having a time of sickness, if you want. I hate to use that word here, but nevertheless, it's hard to get around it. Having an episode of sickness and mental illness during a 6-month period, and suffering from what we call chronic mental illness. Okay, so there's a difference. But if we're talking about chronic severe mental illness, we're talking about 10 million people. The other statistic I want to throw out is that 1 in 4 families wrestles with severe mental illness. Now, that doesn't mean 1 in 4 people have mental illness. It means that 1 in 4 families have, a mother, a father, parent, a kid, a sibling, a close relative who suffers from mental illness. Now, that's a lot. So if you think about the people that you know, you think about the people in your congregation, even though you may not have that high percentage of mentally ill in your congregation, you probably don't, because, again, they tend to be a subgroup and tend to isolate themselves because of the social stigma. You've got the families in your congregation who have people in their household or in the immediate connections who are wrestling with the difficulties of mental illness. So that gives you an overview. Out of that, we're not talking about one disorder, and I think that's a very important thing. I threw out the word schizophrenia, and schizophrenia is a large group. It is not the largest group. The largest group of the mentally ill would be those who suffer from what we call emotional affective disorders, and they're really the biggest diagnosis of that is manic depressive illness, and there's probably 6 to 7% of the population. That means 6 to 7 people out of 100 have manic depressive illness. When you look at just depression, just the mental illness of depression, you're talking to about upward of 20% of the population at one time or another experiences depression. Now, that's a phenomenal statistic. Schizophrenia tends to be 1% of the population. It is the more devastating illness most of the time. Okay, we're talking about 1% of the population. That's not all. We can also talk about anxiety disorders, which can be crippling. That's 13 million people in our country suffer from anxiety disorders. And I was very pleased to hear Marlene's story. Not Marlene. Who was it this morning? Yeah, Marilyn this morning. Marilyn Hall talking about her healing and bout with agoraphobia. And that I would put in the 13 million with anxiety or disorders. So we tend to dismiss anxiety maybe as being less severe, but for agoraphobics, of course, it's a crippling and paralyzing experience. And she talked about her own healing, which really took 5 years. So even within her talk, I was thinking about it, the components of her talk and what she revealed to us. Some of the things is very interesting about mental illness that we could just get out of looking at the brief things that she told us. Anyway, she had a 5-year experience before working with New Thought principles before she considered herself completely healed and free of that particular disorder. Okay, so we're talking about more than one thing. We're talking about a group of illnesses, if you want, using the the disease model. A group of illnesses, and within those groups, there are very different kinds of experiences and very different ways of handling them in terms of medically handling them, in terms of what we consider effective. Another poll in the United States that shows us that 40 to 42% of Americans, when they first have mental illness strike, either themselves or a family member, turn to their clergy for help. Turn to clergy for help. And yet, they rate the clergy as the least helpful out of all the various arms and programs and agencies of help. So initially, 40 to 42% will turn to their church or their synagogue for help, and yet it's not helpful. And so then we're dealing really with an issue of ignorance. That's why they aren't helpful, because they don't understand, and don't understand what mental illness is. And so a couple of things, other than what I've said, a couple of things I want to get across. We talk about what causes mental illness. I love to talk about that, but I don't know if you want to talk about it. I could talk about that for a long time. What causes mental illness, we can talk about what's helpful. We can also talk about, again, what new thought uniquely offers. So I want to just give you a little bit of an overview, and then let's open it up, because we want to address what's important. You're not here just for any reason. You're here because obviously you're interested in one way or another in this particular area. So I want to know what you're interested in. We've got a problem new thought, and Ross mentioned it. Because of our focus and our assumption, of course, our fundamental principle in new thought is that if you have a problem, let's put it in the positive sense, if you have a problem, the solution to life's difficulties is a change of consciousness. The instrument, the primary instrument for changing consciousness is the use of thought. But you see, this is a real dilemma for the mentally ill, because the very instrument that is supposed to be the solution is the thing that is damaged and diseased. Pardon my vocabulary. The thing that is damaged is the very instrument that we are teaching is the solution. And so if we focus only on thought for the mentally ill, we have set up an impossible situation. Because mental illness has to do with illness of the thought processes. Mental illness is defined as, again, a group of illnesses, and I kind of explained that a little bit, each with their varying variations. They're different illnesses. I mean, manic depressive illness is not the same thing as schizophrenia. It's not the same thing as an anxiety disorder, just like whether it makes any difference if you're really metaphysically into metaphysical healing, you don't want to know what the diagnosis is, but nevertheless, people think of themselves that way, and the world functions in that way. It's a different entity, the way, cancer is a different entity than diabetes. It's a different entity, okay? So let's just clarify that. So at least you know what the family has been told. All right. It is a disturbance in the thought processes. And it isn't just a disturbance in the thought process. It also is a disturbance in the feeling nature and in the relating nature. So that one's capacity to think, one's capacity to feel, and one's capacity to relate is disturbed. It isn't the same as a person who doesn't have mental illness. They don't think the same kind of way, they don't feel the same kind of way, and they don't relate to you the same kind of way. Okay? Because of that, there is an impairment in their ability to cope with daily life. Okay, because of the impairment in thought, feeling, and relatedness, their ability to cope with daily life is impaired. Now, out of that come all sorts of ramifications. coupled with, again, the stigma that mental illness carries in our culture. All right, so let's talk for just a moment about, well, how do you make sense of this in terms of what causes mental illness? Especially if you can't focus solely on thought, because if you do, you've set them up for failure. They're not going to be able to think their way into wholeness. How can you think your way into wholeness if you can't think in a way that you can process information and that you can process your thought process? You know, can't process thought in the same way that somebody who's teaching you how you think, see how you need to think. Now, to say that doesn't mean you can't retrain the mentally ill to think. You can retrain their thinking. But there's you got to understand the primary problem here. Certainly, when you're dealing with depression or you're dealing with anxiety, it's a very effective thing to retrain the thinking. Okay, it's a very effective tool. And I do that at Hillside. I have a class, an 8-week class I do in depression. And we go through the whole process of what causes a depression, all the different levels. I'll give you a little taste of that today. And then we focus on the things that we can control. Not everything. We can't control everything. We don't teach that we can control everything. But one thing we can control is we can learn to control our thought processes. And in depression, that's a very effective tool. Okay? But you have to teach people how to do that. You don't teach them how to do that by just teaching them affirmations. Teaching people affirmations is not the same thing as teaching them how to think. Okay? Same way with anxiety disorders. You can teach people how to think in more constructive ways, and ways that help them cope more with reality and the demands of everyday life. You can teach them how to think in ways that are useful to them socializing. Marilyn mentioned learning how to talk at a cocktail party. So you can teach somebody with an anxiety disorder how to think in more constructive ways so they're more functional. You can do that, but it takes time. It takes some work, it takes some understanding of what it is you're dealing with. You can teach a schizophrenic how to think, but that's a much more arduous task. It's very hard work. You can do it, but you got to know what you're doing. And it requires support on other levels of who they are, not just trying to get them to think in ways. In my experience, it requires support on all the different levels of experience. Okay, that's an aside. What do I mean by support on all the different levels? Well, the way I have learned to approach this, now I told you all that other stuff ahead of time, to let you know that this is something I've wrestled with for a long time. And my way of seeing this that's useful and that works is to understand that as human beings we're very complex. And when we're dealing with mood disorders, when we're dealing with mood, why people feel the way they do, and we're dealing with thought disorders, see what can go wrong in our thinking process, you got to look at the whole person. And who are we as human beings? As human beings, we have a body. And as human beings, we have a feeling nature. And as human beings, we have a mind. And as human beings, we are social beings. That means we're connected in a social context. See, that's part of who we are. And we also have our spiritual nature. And the spiritual aspect of mental illness is an interesting sort of side area we could talk about if you want to. All right. So I've described 5 aspects of who we are as human beings. And New Thought deals with one, and that is our mental processes. Okay, our thoughts, our beliefs, our perceptions. Mental is not just thought, it has to do with perceptual capacity, the ability to perceive and process things. All right, I'll tell you a shortcut. If you look at mental illness as a brain disease, you will be more helpful to people than if you look at it as a psychological process. Certainly if you look at schizophrenia as a brain disease, you're going to be much more helpful to families and to the people themselves suffering from it than you will if you look at it as a psychological process. Unfortunately, schizophrenics have gotten the bottom of the barrel in terms of the stigma, and such ideas that schizophrenia somehow split personality, which is totally mythological, has to do, unfortunately, with the naming of the illness, has nothing to do with the reality of the illness. Then it has to do with bad parenting. That, again, it has to do somehow with choice. Instead of seeing it as a devastating brain disease. This is devastating. It doesn't mean it's a hopeless thing. It just means it's a devastating illness. So, if you look at the body, and when I say brain, I mean the body. That's what I mean. It's a brain disease. And, as a matter of fact, most mental illnesses, including the agoraphobia, can be looked upon as brain disorder. Okay, I said that's one level of experience. I didn't say it was a whole level of experience. I said it's one level of experience. Linus Pauling said, behind every crooked thought, there's a crooked molecule. Now, in New Thought, we say, behind every crooked molecule, there's a crooked thought. And, you know, we get into a chicken or the egg dilemma here. Which comes first, chicken or the egg? And really, it doesn't matter that much. What matters is that if, as people called to deal with families and people suffering from mental illness, you have at least some appreciation of the brain as part of their process that they're wrestling with, you'll be a lot more helpful for them than if you don't. So anyway, we're dealing with processes in the brain where the thoughts, the connections to the thoughts, don't operate in the same way that the way your thought processes hang together. Your thought processes hang together in certain kinds of predictable ways. When we're dealing with mental illness, we're dealing with something has, whether it's chicken or the egg, whether it's molecular thought, disrupted the connections between thoughts, okay? And have disrupted the ability to process information, to take information out there, see, and process it based on past experience, and process it based on what is socially appropriate, and sometimes to process it based on what's out there and my thought connectedness, and then communicating that to somebody else. All that is disrupted. Okay? Now that's a problem. But the more we understand about brain chemistry, the more that we're able to have solutions, and that's where medication comes in. Now, I have to speak to this for psychiatric. I say this because people with psychiatric disorders deserve a trial of medication. I heard the New Thought minister say they had never thought about mental illness. I heard the alternative healing person said he could do past life regressions. But you know, I was on the wards where if I put somebody on medication, they got better. And they went home. And they stayed functional. 2/3 of them. A third don't respond well to medication. We don't have much to offer them other than the other kinds of things that we can talk about. It doesn't mean the medication works for everybody. It doesn't mean the medication doesn't have devastating effects, because it can. It just means that when it works well. The opportunity to try. And I say that because your attitude toward medication, when you interact with people who are mentally ill, when you interact with families, it makes a big difference. Yeah, it makes, so that's just one level. When we talk about the body, we talk about a lot of things. So anything that affects the body is going to affect the brain. You realize that. And so there's a lot of things that influence our body that may influence our brain. We can't talk about all that today. We don't have enough time. So we're feeling nature, and it was interesting because Marilyn in her talk mentioned she had kidney disease. Well, I don't think that's unrelated. I think her bout with kidney disease probably did have something to do with her agoraphobia for a lot of different reasons, not just psychological reasons, medical reasons. She also said she discovered in the process of her healing she had a lot of anger, and that the anger was going to have to go. And that makes sense to me, too. I don't see it as one or another. I see it as all of the above, okay? So we have our feeling nature, we have our thought and our belief system. It's very important in all of these things, our expectations, our perceptions of what are happening to us, our habits of thoughts, the beliefs that we are surrounded by. All of these impact us. We have the social context of our life, and I just mentioned one, the stigma. And then, of course, we have our spiritual nature and our spiritual experience. And sometimes people with mental illness may have profound spiritual experiences because of the very nature of the illness. And I can talk about that maybe if you're interested later. But what they don't have is the capacity to integrate that, because the wiring is loose, if you want. Because the wiring is loose. All right. So given all that, and I said I'd talk for just a few minutes of what uniquely New Thought can offer people with these particular kinds of problems. And I think the first one has to do with dignity. Because as a theology, we teach the inherent divinity within every individual. And out of that inherent divinity, you see, comes dignity. So we teach that the individual has dignity, no matter what, because of the inherent divinity. So somebody walking into a church for the first time, suffering, like Marilyn was suffering, or maybe a schizophrenic, or maybe a manic depressive, or maybe somebody profoundly in the throes of depression, or maybe a paralyzing obsessive compulsive, enters into a church for the first time, they're going to hear a message which emphasizes their dignity. It's going to be there. They're going to know it. They're going to feel it. There is underneath the acceptance on that level that the individual has an inherent dignity. Now, when they walk into that church, they may or may not feel accepted by the people there. That's a different story, because the people haven't integrated that teaching, have they? Of course not. They haven't integrated it. So they may or may not feel accepted by the body of the people, but they're going to feel accepted by the teachings. And I think that's, yeah, hopefully you got people trained who are reasonable, but so that's the first thing. The second thing is what I said about the potential of the individual, because we affirm that. We don't stick people into the limitation of anything. So we offer them and we offer their families unlimited possibilities for healing and for life. Unlimited possibilities, no matter what they've been told, no matter how dismal or bleak the prognosis, no matter what this doctor or that doctor has said, or how discouraging the experience, we offer unlimited possibility. See, and that's a ray of hope that you can't get anywhere else. Just can't get anywhere else. We offer a spiritual value system, because sometimes people undergoing difficult situations, like I say, devastating illness, have to reassess their value system. See, maybe they had a son who was always a math whiz. This is not an uncommon story. I've heard it many, many, many times. Math whiz. And they had dreams for this kid. Had dreams that he'd go to college and be an engineer or something. And he has a psychotic break. He doesn't go back to school. Now, maybe the solution there is they're going to have to learn to let that kid go. Maybe they're going to have to learn to let him be who he is and see the value in that. It doesn't mean he can't have a healing. I'm not negating any of that. I'm just saying that the solution might be to rethink their values rather than insisting that life provide them with the dream that they had for somebody else. They shift their values into seeing something else. There's a larger picture here, and New Thought offers that to people, the larger vision about life, and some underpinnings that have to do with value shift about what is really important here, what is important. And then the other thing that we offer is prayer. And when I say prayer, I don't mean prayer that just fixes the brain. Okay? Because sometimes we have that idea that if healing happens, it has to happen somehow by the person fitting in. They be like the rest of us. Rather than seeing that, what the mentally ill need is pretty much what the rest of us need. We need food, housing, clothing, shelter. We need a sense of meaning, some work that we can do in the world, source of income. We need opportunities for relationship and socializing. And I have found over the years of praying for some tough problems and cases, if you want. The power of prayer, not for healing, but for a life. See, and people's lives that take off, even despite whether their little thought processes working the way mine do or not, that they have a life. See, that things open up for them, opportunities open up for them, resources open up for them. So prayer support that is very real and powerful. And to not limit that to just somehow fixing them so that they meet with the image that we think they are. All right, I said that we were going to talk, and I would let you ask some questions. So let's do that. Yeah.
I'm troubled by one of the things you said. There's very much trouble. You said that, I don't remember what the exact figure was, I think you said 2/3 of the patients who are sent home with medication do just fine, and they're just fine. Now, my about-to-be ex-wife is a psychotherapist in the group of VA medicine, and she frequently shared her information about her patients with me, obviously without names, both there and where she had previously been in one of the state's mental health facilities. And her experience was that medication, at its very best, can control the symptoms, but doesn't do a thing about the mental illness unless there is extensive counseling, which may be psychological counseling, maybe spiritual counseling, but some sort of extensive counseling while the medication keeps the symptoms under control so that the counseling can be effective. Otherwise, once the medication ceases, they're right back where they were.
Yeah, I disagree, actually. The research doesn't bear that out. And it depends on what condition you're talking about. I mean, some anxiety can be completely controlled with medication. So can depression. For some people, well, it depends. Well, for me, how's there a difference between the symptom and the...
Because if we can heal the illness, the symptoms will be gone.
What illness is there other than the symptom?
If someone has, to take an analogy on a relatively physical ailment, if someone has pneumonia, the illness is a viral or microbial infection. The symptom is difficulty in breathing. I may be able to sustain the breathing, but if I have not done anything about the microbial infection, I haven't done a thing.
Well, you won't be able to sustain the breathing without getting at the underlying thing. I think that I think here again that's a myth, and that's why I'm zeroing in on it. The myth is the all or nothing quality of it. We're talking about more than one thing, so we're talking about more than one solution. There's certainly some types of disorders where psychotherapy is a solution, but you're really talking about a psychological model that says that underneath the real problem is some psychological issue, and the research doesn't bear that out. See, so you got more than...
You're talking about the medical model, which says there is no underlying psychological issue. The research doesn't bear that out.
No, the medical model is the same regardless. You see, even the psychological is the medical model. Just whether you're talking about biological cause or whether you're talking about psychological cause, it's the same construct. My experience is, and when I said that, I didn't mean that 2/3 go home and they do perfectly fine and then they never have to think about the fact that they're ill again. I didn't mean that. 1/3 do. And again, we're talking about statistics, so I'm lumping large bodies of information together. So I'm talking about 1/3 that really will have a psychotic break and will not have another psychotic break ever, whether they do any homework or not. I mean, they won't. Will they do any homework or not? Why do they have that psychotic break? I don't know. 1/3 will respond to medication. In other words, if they don't get the medication, they're not going to do well. Put them on medication, they do well, and they leave the hospital. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to get themselves in trouble. I think psychotherapy is useful for people to socialize, to stay on their medication, because a lot of them come off their medication. They want to take the medication. And so psychotherapy becomes an educational kind of process and a supportive one that helps you integrate into society even though you've had this problem. That's not the same thing as healing an underlying psychological cause. a third, no matter what you do, they're not going to get better. And you can put them through all the long-term psycho. And when I say that, I'm talking statistics. I didn't say you couldn't have an individual where nothing has worked, and you get them in an intensive treatment program, and they won't have a healing. Those happen, and certainly there have been healings through psychoanalysis. There's been healings through long-term residential treatment programs. I'm sure after talking to this, people will come up and tell me about healings that have happened through practitioner kinds of work. So all of that is possible. But basically, looking at large numbers, a third will really won't be touched. The symptoms won't go away, and the underlying issues won't go away. And that's the 30 to 50% of the homeless are mentally ill, have a mental illness diagnosis. Yeah, we're going to run out of time. We are running out of time.
Question on Peggy said Wednesday night
Mm-hmm.
really impressed on me the fact that my language can be a barrier.
Yeah.
Talking about people, I would have referred somebody to
Uh-huh.
wheelchair user.
Mm-hmm.
I need help in other areas where from past experiences, where you're brought up, you're given words to use without realizing that they're limiting words.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways, and in the brochure, there's talking about our language, how it can be barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Some things that come to mind right away that we can share is that they're common things, words that we use that are actually barriers.
I don't think, I don't have the answer to that. I think it bears a lot of thought. Maybe Rosalyn might want to speak to that because it is a really new field. I mean, I think the term even mental illness itself, there's something, again, it's so catch-all that it does do an injustice. Now, there is a consumer group, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and I brought some of their brochures. Unfortunately, I gave out most of them to the committee, but I've got a little information on them, and they are the ones who have, in fact, been the most advocacy. And, it's an interesting question to ask them. They pretty much call it like you see it. So they say if it's schizophrenia, you say it's schizophrenia. If it's manic depressive illness, you say it's manic depressive illness. But even the term mental illness, doesn't sit right with me because it is such a lumping kind of, and it carries a connotation. I think it's a good one to think about, and I think some of the people who are working on the language project here for INTA ought to think about that. NAMI does have a religious outreach network. No, come on. NAMI does have a religious outreach network because they believe strongly in the role of the church in society for helping the mentally ill integrate. And they have a newsletter, and I brought their address if anybody wants to, write off for their newsletter. Speak to the language issue.
Okay, I knew that was coming. I think part of the problem, I suspect in the program they put some of the Wednesday talk information with some of the Friday talk information. I guess we're going to have a little talk down at the office before next year. In general, non-judgmental language is safer than judgmental language. Language that comes from the disabled community itself is safer than language made up by the media for advertising purposes. For example, the term physically challenged, which I've heard a few disabled people use, that was not a term that ever came out of the community. That was a term made up by advertisers and public relations agencies, same people who write the sound bites for your favorite politician. And to get you started on the language thing, call your local Easter Seal Society and ask for a brochure called Myths and Facts. Most of that deals with physical disability, but it'll get you started on the language issue very well, and some of that could apply to mental illness. There are 3 brochures, in fact, that Easter Seals has as a group, and they kind of go together. And there's an Easter Seals in any state in the Union. There may even be Easter Seals in Canada. You get into the international aspect, and I don't know too much about what's available, but the United Nations might.
Yeah, Chris.
You want to have a microphone?
This is really I hadn't thought about this, but you've confirmed everything. Hi, my name is Chris Pusateri, and I'm the co-chairperson of this committee. Hi, Bongo. Hi, everybody. I had the great privilege, I think it was a privilege now, and quite an honor to experience and participate in the healing of a young man who had a psychotic break. He was a world-class athlete with an academic and athletic scholarship to Stanford University. In his third year, he cracked, as they termed it. And I did not meet him until he had gone through the process of the hospital, drug therapy, counseling. His family had gone through counseling. And he came into my life experience because he had reached a point where they had sent him out to work so that he would have something to do all day. And when I saw him, I was so attracted by the light I saw in his face. So to me, he was just a person, a child of God, whatever. And I identified with his wholeness. I spent the next 8 years being very involved with his family, who are now some of my best friends, with him going to movies, to the beach, to God knows where, Dunkin' Donuts. And many times he would begin conversations with people that I thought were extremely lucid and never gave it a second thought that other people would think that they were very strange. He claims to have had a deep spiritual experience, that he actually had heard what he called the voice of Jesus saying, "I am alive." I am saying this because I would like you all to know that in this process of healing, and what we've heard today about walking or talk, you cannot simply do prayer work and let it go at that, or identify and say, this is, I behold the Christ in you, or whatever. But you really have to be a friend to a person to bring them back into livingness again. And sometimes that takes a lot of doing, and I most particularly remember being in the movie house with him one evening, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And I was laughing hysterically, and he was talking out loud during the whole movie. You know, and this was between the people telling me to stop laughing and him to stop talking. We didn't know which one they identified as having the problem. But it's opening your heart that means so much. That's it. Sure. And I'll turn this over to Bongo.
You're right that it really takes more than just saying a prayer or sitting with someone for a few minutes. We had a mentally ill person come wandering into the church one day, and we really wanted to help him, and over a period of weeks and weeks and weeks began to realize the size of the help he needed. So managed to get some doctors to look at him, and they made a diagnosis, and they worked to get him some help in the institution there in our state. Well, he became, that alienated him from some of his friends in Portland, and he got so mad at me and our church because of that alienation, the stigma. And but he was there. He got help. The medications helped him very much. It was like he had a broken leg. He needed a cast on that. The medications supplied that. And he got out a year and a half later. He wrote me a note, and it was so touching. It said, pretty simply, I'm sorry I was so mad at you. I've really been helped a lot. Can we still be friends? A year and a half later. So sometimes you've got to do the tough love thing.
Let me just tell you the happy beginning to this young man's story, and I turn this over to Larry, is that 2 years ago, he joined the United States Navy as a seaman. He started at the very bottom, even though because of his absolute brilliance, he was offered a much higher rank, but he refused it. And he is stationed on the USS Abraham Lincoln nuclear aircraft carrier and was cited by the commander of the ship as the most outstanding seaman that had ever been on that ship in terms of morale to his fellow seamen. And it's just incredible what he's accomplished through his own soul. And believe me, he did a lot of it himself.
8 years?
Yes, 8 years.
Larry, you had a...
Mental illness may, within its own framework, people, we may lump them into non-functionality, where that isn't necessarily so. We have at our 9 o'clock service every Sunday at 8:30, before any of us get there usually, we have a lady who's, I think, manic depressive, and about a year ago we got a call from Anna Caseman Hospital in Albuquerque that she had attempted suicide? Right. And but she's there every Sunday. She helps set up all the coffee, the donuts, whatever we serve on Sunday morning. She never misses a Sunday. She's absolutely reliable. And I think, that needs to be pointed out, especially in our churches when we're trying to integrate new people into our church, to think, well, if they have a mental issue, we may not trust them to do certain things in our churches. And I think that is a fallacy, because just because they're having a process thing they're working through doesn't mean they can't be functional. So, yeah, she is. And she tithes. If we had 1,000 of her, we would be in good shape, So I wanted to point that out.
Yeah, a couple of comments about that, all of that. One, your story, Chris, too. Certainly my experience over the years is I trust the spiritual experience of the people who have been through mental illness. And I think that it's largely because the levels or the barriers in the mind are loosened. And the good thing about that is they can really enter into what I would call superconscious states in a way that you and I cannot. Unfortunately, because the barriers are loosened, they have a lot of trouble functioning on a day-to-day level, and that's the trade-off. I think that, again, the construct of functionality is real important, because we're not, again, I talked about the chronically mentally ill that tend to be the toughest group. The other people who may be functional and then may go through episodes, particularly in cyclic illness, manic depressive, or some types of depressions, which run in cycles, may be highly functional. In fact, they tend to be the more creative and the brighter elements of society, the intelligence. We have had a number of them who work at the labs. Of course, Albuquerque, the labs, you don't know this, but the labs in Albuquerque and federal labs, this is military labs. We have the highest percentage of PhDs in the world in Albuquerque, in America, in Albuquerque as a city, because of the research, right, wrong, or indifferent, military research that happens. Anyway, we got a lot of people who work in the labs come to our church, and we've had a number of them who go through crises of manic depressive illness or depression, who can get psychotic. They can't function, and then they get pulled back together again, and then they're back, and again, high level of performance and job. So yes, erase that myth that non-functionality goes with mental illness. Yeah.
I want to ask Rob, do you think that practitioners should have more training to recognize, because you're sounding like you're with a separation between spiritual and mental. Should we just be taught to recognize it and turn it over to the medical mode, or do we need more training?
I'd like to see us have more training, and I'd like to see some kind of a model where practitioners and doctors can work together. when I first started in practitioner work, mutual friend of ours said that was happening in Denver, and I don't know if that was happening or not, but I sure haven't seen it happening much from where I go to United Church Practitioner Conferences. I can't speak for anybody else's organization, but that's an idea that I think should be there. But in order for us to work with all the other disciplines, we have to be willing to cooperate with them and work as a team.
I think it's a great idea. Yeah, and part of my sense that is that education doesn't hurt you. See, education doesn't hurt you. You don't need to be afraid of being educated. And I think that a practitioner can be educated without that impairing their consciousness. It makes them more, in a sense, of accessible for people in the community, and certainly working with physicians. I thought a lot about this question that you asked yesterday, Ross, when we were talking about our counseling program, about people making negative comments about people who might be in counseling in the church. And Larry and I were talking about it, and we realized that, I said, that just doesn't happen at our church. We realized that part of why it doesn't happen is because we have so many people in our church who are helpers in society. In other words, we draw a professional congregation of people who are the helpers in Albuquerque. And so we have clinicians, we have therapists, we have a lot of therapists, we have doctors, we have attorneys, people who work with the problems of society. Now, in order to appeal to those people, you've got to be able to understand their point of view, and that's why I'm harping on education. Not because I don't think that the role of the practitioner, like I say, prayer support is invaluable. I mean, there are some cases I worked with that I know it was the prayer, and I had them on the prayer list. This was before I myself was in ministry. I would have cases I wouldn't know what else to do except put them on a prayer list because I was just stuck. Now, if they were trying to do what I was doing, it would have been a mess. The fact that they could go into the presence and just know the presence is what opened up people's lives and opened up me, because when I was a treating physician, I would find myself having insights. I hadn't thought about that. I could change this. I could make this adjustment. You see, a medication or something. It occurred to me. Things that I hadn't seen opened up in me, and I got out of the way to let something happen. And I know that was prayer work. So their role may be the same, but, education is going to hurt you. It's going to make you more accessible. I'm sure we've run over, and I don't want to keep anybody. It's just, like I say, I could go on and on and on. So should we stop? Let's have a closing before we leave, and then if anybody else wants to talk, we can talk. Let's just close by simply trusting in God as a healing activity in our lives, in the lives of our families, in the lives of the people, all the people that we touch. God is a healing activity. We let the wisdom of God and the powers of God open up to let that healing happen in God's way. So we'll simply trust that that's so, and we'll let it be so. So it is. Amen.